The sun had long disappeared behind the ragged hills of northern Arkansas when the first whispers reached the townsfolk. It was early spring of 1907, and the chill still clung to the ground like a shadow refusing to yield. Widow's Creek, a meandering trickle through the dense woods, had always been a quiet, forgotten place, until the morning they found Martha Langley. In the early hours of a damp spring morning in 1907, the first hints of an unimaginable tragedy spread through the sleepy town near Widow's Creek. Farmers, roused before dawn by the lowing of cattle or the creak of wagon wheels, were the first to notice something unusual along the creek's banks. The water, shallow and sluggish, had always been predictable, a quiet ribbon threading through the dense woods, its bed littered with fallen branches and smooth stones, its occasional pool barely deep enough to submerge a child. But that morning the landscape seemed subtly altered, a disquieting hush settling over the familiar terrain, as if the land itself held its breath in anticipation. Elias Harper, a middle-aged farmer known for his cautious nature and sharp eye, had risen early to inspect his fences and check the livestock. His boots sank into the moist soil as he made his way down the winding path toward the creek, his lantern casting long, jittering shadows against the trees. As he approached, a shape lying motionless near the edge of the water caught his attention. At first he thought it might be a discarded bundle of clothing or perhaps a stray animal, but as he drew closer, the terrible truth became apparent. There, face down in the barely there water, was Martha Langley. The sight was surreal. Martha was a widow in her late 30s, a woman of quiet routine who had rarely attracted attention beyond the occasional nod to neighbors or the polite smile given to passing travelers. She had tended her small garden, kept her home tidy, and avoided unnecessary interaction, living a life measured and unassuming. Yet here she was, sprawled in the shallow creek, her body unnaturally still, the signs of drowning, water in her lungs, foam at her mouth, impossible given the negligible depth. The foam clung to her lips and nostrils like some otherworldly residue, and her hair, dark and tangled, floated over the muddy surface. The shallow water rippled faintly as the wind whispered through the reeds, carrying the faintest echo of the town's first shock. Elias, though accustomed to the rhythms of the land and the inevitability of death in farming life, froze. His heart raced and he called out, half hoping for a startled reply, half wishing to summon confirmation that this was not real. No sound answered him beyond the distant crow of a rooster and the rustle of branches. The quiet seemed to amplify the horror, making the shallow creek feel like a vast abyss. As he backed away to fetch the sheriff, the morning light began to reveal more details: the unnatural angle of her limbs, the stillness that refused to align with the gentle current, and the impossibility of her death in water that barely reached her knees. By the time the town's authorities arrived, news had begun to spread along the muddy roads and across farmhouses. Men and women gathered, their expressions ranging from disbelief to a growing, gnawing fear. Conversations whispered over fences and through open windows spoke of Martha's life, her solitude, and the sudden, inexplicable violence that had claimed her. Farmers compared the creek that morning to the one they had crossed just days prior, noting its familiar shallowness, and yet the body told a story that defied understanding. Each observer, looking down at the pale, lifeless figure, was forced to confront the unimaginable, a drowning in waters too shallow to drown, a cruel impossibility that would set the tone for the months of dread to follow. Martha Langley had lived on the outskirts of town for nearly a decade, a widow who had quietly shaped her life around routine and solitude. After her husband's death from a sudden fever, she had retreated into a world of careful order and self-sufficiency, tending to her modest garden, raising a few chickens, and maintaining her small wooden home with meticulous care. To the neighbors who occasionally glimpsed her through the fog of early mornings or late evenings, she appeared unremarkable, a woman who smiled politely, spoke in measured tones, and vanished just as quickly behind the screen of her front door. Yet beneath that calm exterior, there were layers of resilience and isolation that few understood. Martha's life had been one of quiet labor and discreet observation. She was known to rise before sunrise, working her garden while the air was still crisp, the dew clinging to the leaves and the soil rich and dark beneath her fingers. She grew vegetables with precision, arranged flowers in small jars along her windowsills, and tended to the chickens with an almost ritualistic care. The townsfolk respected her diligence, though many admitted they knew little of her past beyond her widowhood. Children whispered that she spoke to no one for days at a time, and some of the older residents recalled that her late husband had been a stern, private man, the kind whose silence lingered long after he was gone. Despite her reputation for quietude, Martha had connections. She traded produce and eggs with neighbors, lent a helping hand when illness or injury struck, and attended the occasional church gathering, though she preferred to remain on the edges of the congregation rather than in its center. There were hints of warmth in her interactions, a fleeting smile to a child, a whispered encouragement to a weary neighbor. But these moments were brief and rare, like sunlight breaking through a dense canopy. It was precisely this balance of visibility and concealment that made her death all the more shocking. She had lived a life of careful boundaries, and yet in the end, she was found vulnerable in a place she had known intimately, her routines offering no protection against the inexplicable fate that had befallen her. Those who knew her described Martha as methodical, intelligent, and wary, qualities that made the circumstances of her death even more confounding. She was not the type to wander near the creek after dark, nor had she shown any interest in risking her safety along the uneven banks. Her home bore no signs of intrusion, and the few personal belongings she treasured, handwritten letters, family mementos, a well-worn Bible, remained undisturbed. This juxtaposition between her cautious nature and the violent finality of her discovery created a tension in the town's collective imagination. How could someone so deliberate and observant, so intimately familiar with the environment around her, succumb to a death that defied all logic? In recounting her life, the townspeople began to notice patterns they had overlooked. The solitary walks she took at dusk along familiar paths, the careful way she managed her property, the letters she sometimes sent to distant relatives recounting mundane observations of the land. Each detail underscored her self-reliance and prudence, qualities that seemed incompatible with the mystery of her demise. Yet despite the clarity of her character, Martha's life offered no clues to the fate that awaited her. It was a stark reminder that even the most measured existence could be abruptly disrupted, leaving behind questions that stretched beyond understanding, and a portrait of a woman whose quiet strength could not shield her from an unfathomable end. When Sheriff Calloway and the coroner first examined Martha Langley's body, the evidence defied all conventional understanding of drowning. The shallow creek, barely reaching her calves, offered no rational explanation for the waterlogged lungs, the frothy residue around her mouth, or the pallor that had settled over her features with eerie finality. Each detail was a contradiction, a physical record of a death that should have been impossible given the environment. The coroner, a methodical man accustomed to farm accidents and the occasional violent crime, furrowed his brow as he took meticulous notes, tapping his gloved fingers against the rim of his leather-bound ledger as if to summon some rational interpretation from the stubbornly irrational scene before him. The first anomaly was immediately apparent: the water in her lungs. Martha's lungs were saturated, heavy and fluid-filled in a manner consistent with classical drowning, yet the creek itself offered no volume sufficient to account for such internal flooding. The coroner measured the depth, tested the flow, and even retraced the creek's course upstream, discovering only the faintest pools, shallow depressions in the muddy bed where a child might have splashed but not an adult succumbed. Yet there it was in her body, undeniable in its physicality. The froth, too, was a detail that troubled them. It clung stubbornly to her lips and nostrils, tinged with a faint blue hue in the dim morning light, and suggested a violent respiratory struggle, a desperate intake of water that could not have been supplied by the meager creek. Further complicating the picture were the marks on her skin. Small abrasions, likely from branches or rough soil, were present, but there was no evidence of a fall or struggle large enough to explain her condition. Her clothing, damp but intact, showed no signs of tearing or entanglement that might suggest she had been pulled or dragged. It was as though the act that ended her life had occurred without physical interference from the outside world, leaving only her body as a testimony to an inexplicable event. Witnesses offered conflicting accounts that only deepened the mystery. A neighbor recalled seeing her tending the garden late the previous evening, while another claimed to have heard faint cries from the creek around midnight. Footprints were scarce and inconsistent, vanishing in the soft earth as if swallowed by the land itself. and the few impressions that remained were difficult to reconcile with the final position of her body. The creek, silent and shallow, seemed almost complicit in the impossibility, a setting that should have ensured safety, but instead had become a silent witness to a death that contradicted every known principle of physics and biology. Even the most seasoned investigators were unsettled by the physiological evidence. How could the body show all the hallmarks of drowning, water in the lungs, pulmonary edema, frothy fluids, without the necessary environment? The anomaly did not merely confuse, it unsettled the mind, suggesting either a scenario beyond human comprehension or some force that had acted upon her with precise lethality. As reports circulated through town, the story spread quickly, carrying with it a sense of dread. The coroner's notes, the sheriff's observations, and the whispered testimonies combined into a narrative that refused rational closure, leaving the residents to grapple with a death that was, in every measurable way, impossible. As news of Martha Langley's death spread through the town, speculation ran rampant, fueled as much by fear as by curiosity. The people of early 20th century Arkansas were no strangers to hardship, superstition, and the inexplicable twists of rural life, and the circumstances of Martha's demise seemed to defy not only logic, but natural law itself. The shallow creek, the saturated lungs, and the absence of any discernible cause created fertile ground for rumor, and the whispers began to weave themselves into a tapestry of dread and suspicion that spread like wildfire along the dirt roads and through the wooden porches of the town. Some spoke of a curse, a lingering malediction on the land surrounding Widow's Creek. The area had always carried a reputation for strangeness, animals behaving oddly, sudden fogs rising from the creek at unexpected hours, and a sense of being watched by unseen eyes. Older residents recalled tales passed down from their parents, stories of grief and vengeance, of spirits angered by trespassers or those who disturbed the delicate balance of the forest and water. To these minds, Martha's death was no accident. It was the inevitable consequence of disturbing something older and more powerful than human understanding. Children were warned to stay away from the banks, and even grown men hesitated to venture near the water after dusk, uneasy under the weight of unseen scrutiny. Others refused to rely on superstition, instead turning their suspicion toward human motives. Widow Langley, though reserved, had inherited her husband's modest property and managed it with diligence. Some speculated that neighbors or travelers with more aggressive ambitions could have sought to exploit her solitude, committing a crime so meticulously that it left behind no conventional evidence. In hushed conversations over breakfast or behind closed doors, townspeople considered the possibility of an intruder or someone harboring a secret grudge. The lack of struggle or footprints only intensified the speculation. If foul play was involved, it must have been executed with a precision and cunning that unsettled even the most skeptical observers. These rumors fed one another, blending the natural with the supernatural until it became difficult to separate fact from fear. A farmer passing near the creek at dawn claimed he saw the water ripple as if something had moved beneath the surface. A neighbor swore that faint cries had carried on the wind, cries that could not belong to any living creature in the area. Each anecdote, whether true or imagined, lent weight to the growing sense of unease. Townspeople began to notice small disturbances, tools misplaced, livestock skittish, and doors left slightly ajar, all interpreted as omens of something malevolent lurking nearby. The local church, a hub for communal guidance, became a stage for the negotiation of these fears. Reverend Thompson urged caution, speaking of divine mysteries beyond human understanding and encouraging prayer for the soul of Martha Langley. Parishioners listened, some comforted, others emboldened in their own theories of spectral vengeance or hidden malice. The church's sermons, the gossip along the roads, and the watchful eyes of neighbors created a collective atmosphere in which reason seemed fragile, overshadowed by the weight of possibility, human, supernatural, or something in between. Through these discussions, the town began to fracture along lines of belief. Some clung to logic, determined to find a rational explanation. Others surrendered to superstition, interpreting every shadow and sound as confirmation of Martha's mysterious fate. And as the whispers circulated, each new retelling added details that may have never existed, shaping a narrative that transformed a singular tragedy into a pervasive, almost living, legend that held the town in its quiet, unrelenting grip. Sheriff Calloway, a man known for his methodical approach to law and order, found himself confronting a case that defied both reason and precedent. The investigation into Martha Langley's death quickly became a labyrinth of contradictions and incomplete evidence. From the very beginning, the town's geography seemed to conspire against him. The banks of Widow's Creek were uneven, softened by years of spring rains and seasonal floods, the soil loose and easily disturbed, making it nearly impossible to track footprints with any certainty. Any impression left by a person moving through the area might have been erased by wind or water before it could offer a clue. When Calloway and his deputies scoured the banks, they found only partial prints, some muddied and distorted, others abruptly ending as if their source had vanished into thin air. Witnesses, too, proved frustratingly unreliable. Each brought their own perspective, often colored by fear or imagination. One neighbor insisted she had seen Martha tending her garden well after dark, while another swore he had heard muffled cries drifting from the creek around midnight. These accounts were inconsistent, sometimes conflicting even in minor details: clothing, posture, the direction she was walking, the presence of a light in the distance. Calloway knew that in rural towns, perception could easily be swayed by rumor. Yet he could not dismiss the possibility that some of these observations were accurate. The challenge was sifting the credible from the fanciful, an almost impossible task in a community already gripped by suspicion. Physical evidence offered few solutions and more questions. The coroner confirmed the presence of water in Martha's lungs, yet the creek's depth and flow could not account for such saturation. Her clothing was damp but intact, showing no signs of struggle that might indicate foul play, and no footprints suggested anyone had dragged her to the water. Broken branches and disturbed soil hinted at movement, yet the patterns were inconsistent and scattered, suggesting activity that might have been natural or deliberate, but offering no clear narrative. Each observation seemed to deepen the mystery rather than illuminate it, leaving the sheriff with the unsettling sensation of chasing shadows through a fog that grew thicker with each passing day. Compounding the difficulty was the growing tension among townspeople. Fear had transformed ordinary neighbors into wary informants, their reticence or exaggeration hampering the investigation. Some withheld details, reluctant to speak of strange occurrences near the creek. Others embellished, convinced that the more sensational the story, the more attention it would receive. Calloway found himself mediating between conflicting accounts, weighing the reliability of individuals whose judgment was clouded by panic and superstition. Even practical measures such as mapping the creek or attempting controlled searches yielded minimal results, leaving him reliant on fragments of observation and the occasional hint of evidence that offered promise but no resolution. As the investigation unfolded, Sheriff Calloway's uncertainty became as palpable as the morning mist over Widow's Creek. He documented every detail, from the minute abrasions on Martha's hands to the subtle shifts in the creek's muddy banks, yet every lead seemed to split into two directions, each plausible but ultimately inconclusive. Despite his persistence, the case resisted resolution, a puzzle that refused completion. Even months later, the same questions lingered. Had someone been present? Was the environment itself somehow culpable? Or had forces beyond human comprehension claimed Martha Langley that night, leaving behind only traces that teased but never revealed the truth? By the summer of 1907, the strange circumstances surrounding Martha Langley's death had transformed Widow's Creek from a quiet, almost forgotten stretch of water into a locus of fear and suspicion. The initial shock of her demise gave way to a creeping sense of dread as the weeks passed, particularly when additional unusual events began to occur in the same area. The shallow waters of the creek, once regarded as harmless, now seemed charged with a hidden menace, and those who approached its banks did so with trepidation. Ordinary activities such as fetching water or tending nearby fields became exercises in heightened awareness, with eyes constantly scanning the reeds and tree line for signs of danger. The first indications of escalation were subtle. A stray dog belonging to a nearby farm was found dead, its body floating unnaturally in the shallow pool where it had been playing. At first, townspeople dismissed it as coincidence or misadventure, yet the pattern soon became impossible to ignore. Travelers passing through the area reported eerie sensations, claiming the air grew inexplicably heavy near the creek, that whispers seemed to drift on the wind, and that shadows moved with a will of their own. Farmers found their fences disturbed, gates left ajar, and livestock behaving nervously, as though the land itself were restless. Each incident, minor in isolation, coalesced into an atmosphere of growing paranoia. Then there were the disappearances. A traveling peddler who had camped near the creek vanished without a trace, leaving behind only his scattered belongings. Search parties combed the banks, the surrounding woods, and even the shallow waters themselves, but found nothing. Not a footprint, not a clue, nothing to explain his absence. Soon afterward, another local resident, a man known for his skepticism of superstition, was discovered lifeless near the creek's edge, exhibiting the same hallmarks of drowning, despite the absence of deep water. These events began to suggest a pattern that no one could rationalize. Death and disappearance clustering around a location that should have been innocuous. Tension rippled through the town like an electric current. Conversations at the general store, the post office, and even church gatherings were dominated by speculation, fear, and self-preservation. Neighbors whispered warnings, parents forbade children from wandering near the water, and even the most rational men found themselves pausing before crossing the creek, suddenly aware of its deceptive shallowness. The sheriff, overwhelmed and frustrated, struggled to maintain authority while contending with growing panic. Investigators noted that the physical evidence remained as confounding as ever. No additional footprints, no signs of struggle, no tangible mechanism to account for the deaths. The escalation of events gave rise to theories both practical and fantastical. Some believed the creek had become cursed, haunted by the restless spirit of Martha Langley or some older, more vengeful force. Others suspected a calculated hand, perhaps a criminal moving with cunning and patience, exploiting the town's fear to conceal the truth. Yet even in the face of these theories, tangible answers remained elusive. Each day brought new stories, reports of cries in the night, glimpses of figures vanishing into the fog, unexplained ripples along the banks, all reinforcing the idea that Widow's Creek had transformed from a benign natural feature into a site of mounting terror. The community's response was one of defensive ritual as much as investigation. Farmers walked in pairs, neighbors patrolled the edges of their property, and families reinforced doors and windows. The town seemed to shrink inward, as if the very boundaries of safety had contracted under the weight of the unexplained. And all the while the creek remained, deceptively calm and shallow, a silent witness to the growing pattern of fear and death that had begun to define its presence in the lives of those who lived nearby. Despite months of investigation and the tireless efforts of Sheriff Calloway and his deputies, the mystery of Martha Langley's death at Widow's Creek remained unresolved, leaving a shadow over the town that would endure for decades. The coroner's reports, meticulous in their detail, confirmed what everyone already feared. Martha had drowned, her lungs filled with water, her body displaying all the hallmarks of submersion, yet the creek itself was too shallow to have caused such a fate. Attempts to identify any human culprit yielded nothing. No footprints led to or from the scene, no signs of struggle or forced entry appeared in her home, and no witnesses could provide a consistent account of events. Each day of fruitless searching deepened the town's unease, reinforcing the sense that they had been confronted with something beyond comprehension. Over time, the case began to take on the qualities of legend. Farmers told their children of Martha's final hours, embellishing the story with each retelling, how her body appeared to float as though suspended by invisible hands, how the creek seemed to ripple unnaturally even on windless days, how an eerie quiet fell over the area when one approached its banks. The line between fact and folklore blurred, as the townspeople wove their fear into a narrative that made sense of what defied reason. Skeptics were dismissed or whispered about as fools, while those attuned to superstition insisted that Widow's Creek was a place marked by forces that human understanding could not penetrate. Subsequent deaths and disappearances only cemented the area's dark reputation. Other bodies were found under circumstances eerily similar to Martha's, drowned without water, lifeless yet showing signs of struggle in the absence of any visible threat. The town began to avoid the creek entirely. Even the most rational residents regarded it with a mix of wariness and reverence, as though approaching the water might draw the same inexplicable fate. Travelers passing through whispered tales of the widows, creek curse, and maps of the region began to bear the creek as a place to be noted but not approached. The mystery also prompted reflection among those who sought rational explanations. Scholars, visiting officials, and curious observers speculated about natural phenomena. Gases rising from the creek, hidden springs, or unusual physical conditions that might account for drowning in shallow water. Yet these theories never fully satisfied either investigators or townspeople. The lack of concrete evidence meant that the mystery retained its power precisely because it could not be neatly explained. Every possible scenario, accident, malice, supernatural interference, was undermined by the stubborn facts that defied them. In the generations that followed, Widow's Creek became a symbol of the limits of human understanding. Children grew up hearing the story of Martha Langley as both cautionary tale and local legend, a narrative teaching respect for the unknown, vigilance in the face of danger, and humility when confronted with events beyond explanation. Scholars studying early 20th century rural communities later noted that cases like Martha's revealed much about human psychology, how fear can shape memory, how rumor can solidify into truth, and how unsolved tragedies can transform into enduring folklore that shapes the identity of a place. Even today, the creek runs quietly through the landscape, shallow and unassuming, yet laden with the memory of that spring in 1907. The story of Martha Langley and the inexplicable drowning that claimed her life continues to captivate, disturb, and fascinate, a testament to the town's collective fear, the persistence of rumor and legend, and the enduring power of a mystery that refuses closure. As the waters of Widow's Creek continue to flow quietly through the hills of Arkansas, we are left with more questions than answers. Martha Langley's life, her solitude, and her mysterious death remind us that some truths may never be unearthed, and that the most ordinary places can hide shadows too deep to measure. What forces, human or otherwise, might have claimed her? Could the land itself hold secrets we are not meant to understand? Or does the darkness come from within the hearts of those around her? Stories like these linger in the mind long after the last word is spoken. They whisper to us in the quiet hours when the world feels still, asking whether we truly know the people, the places, or even the past itself. If this tale unsettled you, if it made you question what is possible or impossible, then you are not alone. Subscribe now to our channel and join us as we continue to explore the hidden corners of history, the cases that confound investigators, and the mysteries that refuse closure. Comment below and tell us what you believe happened at Widow's Creek. Do you think it was human malice, a cruel twist of fate, or something beyond comprehension? Your thoughts, your theories, and even your doubts are part of the conversation. Stay with us, because the next story may take you deeper into the shadows, to places where history blurs with legend, and where the line between reality and the unexplainable grows impossibly thin. Every whisper, every detail, every account brings us closer, but not always to the answers we seek. What would you have done if you had been there that night at Widow's Creek?